There is a woman somewhere, perhaps in a dim apartment, perhaps in a quiet bedroom where the glow of a screen is the only light, who keeps returning to the same kind of message. Rationally, she might say it is just the algorithm, that it is coincidence or boredom, yet something beneath that rational surface will not let go. A restlessness moves in her chest like an unanswered question. She has carried this feeling for weeks or months, an invisible thread that binds her inner world to the presence of one particular person. It is not simply attraction. It is not even just longing. It is as if her life, with all its apparent randomness, has been leading her toward a single point of recognition. She is afraid to name it, afraid to be told she is exaggerating, fantasizing, or clinging to a story. And still, the feeling persists, quieter than fear but stronger than doubt. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the unconscious steps forward. The psyche does not shout, it repeats. It sends the same symbol, the same dream, the same face, again and again, until the surface mind grows too tired to resist. What she is experiencing is not mere fantasy, but a meeting between conscious awareness and the deeper field of the soul, where archetypes live and ancient patterns unfold. The person she cannot forget appears not only as an individual, but as an archetypal figure, the beloved, the guide, the mirror. On that symbolic level, this encounter is not random at all. It is a summons. Her essence recognizes something in the other that speaks directly to her destiny. She has tried to silence this inner voice. Old wounds tell her to be careful. Experiences of rejection, abandonment, or betrayal whisper that intense feelings are dangerous. The mind, shaped by past pain, questions everything. Is this love, or is it obsession? Is it a true connection, or is it emotional dependency disguised as romance? Yet beneath the noise of fear, something in her remains untouched and unwavering. Jung called this deeper organizing center the self, the core of wholeness that knows her path long before the ego can admit it. The certainty she feels is not the certainty of control, but the quiet recognition of alignment. On some level, the self is saying, this encounter matters. One of the first signs that she is not simply trapped in illusion is the strange peace she feels beneath the turmoil. Even in silence, even during distance, there are moments when the thought of this person brings not panic, but calm. It is not the fragile peace of reassurance or constant contact. It is a deeper, inner stillness, as if her soul knows that something essential cannot be taken from her. In Jungian terms, the connection touches the realm of the timeless, a layer of experience that is not bound to immediate outcomes. The ego worries about whether the story will end in happily ever after. The soul simply recognizes a resonance and rests in it. This peculiar peace is not born of denial, it is born of recognition. The second sign is the awakening of her own essence. Before this person appeared, certain parts of her identity lay hidden or dormant. Old talents slept, courage remained theoretical, desires for a more authentic life stayed safely locked away. Then, suddenly, in the reflection of this connection, things began to move. She started to sense her own depth, her own capacity for love, her own longing to live more honestly. This is the work of the inner archetype of the beloved. It does not simply demand devotion to another, it calls forth devotion to one's own soul. She discovers that this person does not just occupy her thoughts, they act as a catalyst for her individuation, the journey toward becoming fully herself. From the outside, this might look like weakness, like losing herself in someone else. But in truth, what is awakening is not weakness, but power. She is forced to confront patterns that kept her small, the need to be chosen to feel worthy, the fear of being too much, the habit of shrinking her feelings to make others comfortable. The intensity of the connection becomes a mirror that reveals her shadow, the parts of herself she once rejected or abandoned, her fear of dependency, her terror of being unlovable, her tendency to idealize and then punish herself for it. All of this rises to the surface. This is not punishment, it is psychic surgery. The encounter tears open what was numbed so that healing can finally begin. The third sign is the stubborn endurance of the feeling. Infatuation fades with distraction. Ego impulses dissolve when starved of attention, but this connection persists, even when she tries to move on, even when she analyzes it from every angle, even when she attempts to bury it under work, noise, or new faces. Time, instead of erasing it, deepens it. This persistence is not proof that the other person is perfect, but it is evidence that the connection touches something beyond the usual cycles of desire and disappointment. In Jungian language, it carries the weight of a soul contract, a preconscious pattern of meaning that insists on being lived, not merely imagined. And yet, if this bond is so real, so significant, why is there distance? Why silence? Why separation? Why delay? On the level of the ego, it feels cruel. On the level of psyche, it is preparation. The universe, or if one prefers, the self, the inner organizing intelligence, does not unite two half-formed people in an energy as powerful as a true soul connection without first demanding growth. Without this, the relationship would become a battlefield of projections, each partner using the other as a screen for their unresolved wounds, each confusing control with love. The pause is not rejection, it is a boundary drawn by higher wisdom to protect what is sacred from being destroyed by immaturity. For the woman listening, or for the one who recognizes herself between these words, this phase of life is not a lonely accident. It is an initiation. Her longing, her confusion, her recurring signs and synchronicities are all expressions of a deeper process. The call to step into her own emotional sovereignty. She is being asked not to worship the other, but to reclaim herself, not to wait passively for rescue, but to walk consciously into her own power. The connection is real, the resonance is real, but its highest purpose is not to complete her. Its purpose is to awaken the queen within her, the woman who knows that love is not a chain, but a mirror in which her own wholeness is reflected back. What she interprets as abandonment or uncertainty is, in truth, a dismantling of the old structures within her psyche. The distance forces her inward, away from the external fixation of longing, and toward the quiet chambers where her own shadows wait to be recognized. Jung taught that when a woman projects her unlived inner life onto another, especially onto a figure who awakens intense emotion, the universe responds not by fulfilling the fantasy but by asking her to reclaim the projection. The person she cannot forget becomes the carrier of her own lost potential, the embodiment of the passion, courage, clarity, or vulnerability she has not yet fully allowed herself to embody. This is why the pull feels ancient, why the feeling refuses to fade. She is not merely drawn to the other person, she is drawn to a forgotten dimension of herself. The pause, then, becomes an arena of transformation. In the silence, she begins to see how often she surrendered her power in past relationships, how quickly she abandoned her boundaries to avoid losing affection, how deeply she feared being left behind. She realizes that the ache she feels now is not only about the other person, it is the echo of every time she silenced her needs, every moment she accepted crumbs and called them love, every season in which she believed that devotion required self-erasure. The connection that haunts her now brings these patterns into sharp relief, not to torment her, but to liberate her. The universe is not preparing her to chase someone, it is preparing her to meet herself. On the other side of the silence, the other person faces their own dark night. Their withdrawal is not indifference but confrontation. The same archetype that awakens her also stirs the depths of their unconscious, drawing out old wounds, fears of vulnerability, and buried stories about love and worth. They may run, but the running offers no relief. The distractions that once numbed them now fall flat. Their ego, terrified of intimacy yet starving for connection, begins to crumble under the weight of its own defenses. They are learning the lesson she has already begun to grasp. No one outruns the truth of the soul. The universe gently but relentlessly dismantles the illusions that kept them safe but small, forcing them into an uncomfortable honesty with themselves. Yet her journey cannot revolve around their awakening. A woman's empowerment does not depend on whether someone else chooses growth. Her task is to continue the process of individuation, the slow, courageous descent into her own psyche, where she learns to tend her wounds rather than hide them. She begins to cultivate emotional sovereignty, an inner steadiness not dependent on validation or attention. She discovers that desire need not collapse into desperation, that longing does not require her to abandon herself. In this space of inner work, she starts to reorient her identity. She is no longer the one who waits anxiously on the edge of hope. She becomes the one who listens inward, who trusts her intuition without being enslaved by it, who honors her heart without sacrificing her dignity. As she deepens into herself, she encounters the archetype of the inner warrior, the fierce feminine presence that refuses to settle for half-hearted love or fragmented connection. This warrior is not cold or detached. She is discerning. She understands that true intimacy requires two whole people, not one whole person chasing the wounded half of another. She refuses to participate in dynamics that drain her spirit. She learns that she can love deeply while still holding her boundaries with grace. She recognizes that longing is not weakness. It is evidence that her heart is awake, but an awake heart does not kneel. It stands. In time, she sees the purpose of the separation for what it truly is, not a void, but a crucible, a place where the illusions die so the truth can emerge, a space in which she is shaped into a woman capable of holding love without losing herself. This evolution does not erase the connection, it clarifies it. What felt once like unbearable longing becomes a quieter, more anchored knowing. The fear of losing the other dissolves into the awareness that what is meant for her does not have to be chased. Her energy shifts from seeking to becoming, from waiting to unfolding, from hoping to embodying. The more she steps into her wholeness, the more the symbolic threads of destiny rearrange themselves around her. She feels it in her intuition, in her dreams, in the increasing synchronicities that echo through her days, and yet she no longer clings to these signs. She receives them, but she no longer depends on them. Her worth is no longer tied to whether someone returns. Her life is no longer suspended in expectation. She becomes magnetic precisely because she has stopped trying to attract. Her radiance grows not from what she hopes to gain, but from who she is becoming. In this transformation, the connection shifts from a source of torment to a mirror of her awakening. It still lives within her, but it no longer consumes her. She honors it without idolizing it. She feels it without fearing it. And in this newfound balance, she realizes something profound. The return of the other is no longer the center of her story. She is, as her center strengthens, something remarkable begins to unfold. She no longer interprets the silence as punishment. Instead, she recognizes it as a rite of passage orchestrated by a deeper intelligence within her psyche. The absence of the other person stops feeling like a wound and starts revealing itself as a catalyst, an initiation into self-trust. In Jungian terms, she begins integrating the animus, the inner masculine principle that governs clarity, direction, and agency. For most of her life, this inner figure had been projected outward onto others, especially onto the person whose presence stirred her so fiercely. Now, for the first time, she begins retrieving this projection. The qualities she once believed lived only in the other's strength, certainty, purpose, begin awakening within her. With each inner step, she dismantles the old belief that her fulfillment depends on someone else's presence, attention, or validation. She sees how often she confused longing with destiny, attachment with love, and pain with depth. The unconscious patterns forged in childhood, those early experiences where affection was unpredictable or conditional, had taught her to associate emotional intensity with importance. Yet in the clarity of this pause, she discovers a more grounded truth. Real connection is not defined by turbulence, but by resonance. And resonance does not demand suffering, it requires presence. Her presence, her wholeness, this realization does not erase the bond. Instead, it refines it. She begins to understand the difference between the ego's desire for possession and the soul's yearning for expansion. The ego wants guarantees, it wants labels, timelines, outcomes. The soul wants growth, it wants to evolve through relationship, not cling to it. It wants to open, not grasp. As she shifts her identity from the grasping ego to the expanding soul, her relationship with the connection matures. She stops seeking reassurance. She stops checking for signs to soothe her anxiety. She stops replaying past moments like rituals of self-doubt. Instead, she turns her attention inward, toward the territory she had avoided for so long, her own unmet needs, her own unlived desires, her own unclaimed authority. This inward turn marks the beginning of emotional sovereignty. She learns that she is not responsible for the other person's awakening, nor is she required to shrink so they feel safer. She releases the unspoken belief that love must hurt before it can heal. The narrative she carried that she must prove herself worthy of someone's return begins to unravel. Worthiness is not a reward for patience. It is the foundation of consciousness. Love, she discovers, is not a transaction, it is an alignment. Meanwhile, in the unseen spaces of their life, the other person undergoes a parallel transformation. Though she cannot witness it directly, she intuits the shifts taking place behind their silence. Their previous strategies, avoidance, distraction, rationalization, begin to crumble under the weight of their own dissatisfaction. The emptiness they feel without her is not romantic longing alone, it is the confrontation with their own shadow. She had reflected back to them a version of themselves they were not yet ready to claim. Vulnerable, open-hearted, capable of depth, the distance forces them to face the protective armor they once believed necessary. Slowly, painfully, they begin to realize that what they fled was not her love, but their own fear of receiving it. This awakening, however, does not require her intervention. Her growth becomes the quiet permission for them to evolve at their own pace, and so the silence becomes spacious, no longer a void, but a field of becoming. As she reclaims her projections, another archetype emerges within her, the inner queen. The queen does not beg for loyalty. She does not collapse at the threat of loss. She does not diminish her power to secure affection. The queen knows that love aligned with destiny cannot be coerced, and what is not aligned cannot be held. This knowing liberates her. She becomes deliberate in her choices, intentional in her boundaries, and tender with her heart, no longer reckless, no longer self-sacrificing. Her longing turns into discernment, her devotion turns into clarity. With this inner sovereignty blooming, her energy shifts. She becomes magnetic, not because she is trying to attract anything, but because she is no longer leaking her power. Her attention returns to her own life, the passions she postponed, the dreams she silenced, the self-expression she once feared. Her sensitivity, once a source of shame, becomes a compass. Her emotional depth, once dismissed as fragility, becomes her strength. The more she embodies her truth, the more the universe rearranges around her in subtle but undeniable ways. And yet, despite all this transformation, the bond she feels does not vanish. Instead, it evolves. It becomes less about reunion and more about resonance, less about desire and more about meaning, less about the other and more about the parts of her soul that were awakened through them. She begins to see the connection as a symbolic bridge, a threshold that initiated her into her own becoming. This reframing dissolves the last remnants of fear. She is no longer terrified of losing them because she has finally found herself. As her inner world stabilizes, something changes in the texture of reality around her. She begins to notice how the universe communicates through subtle alignments, encounters, timing, symbols, dreams. But unlike before, she no longer clings to these signs with anxious hope. She receives them with calm awareness, almost like a woman who has learned to read the language of her own psyche. She knows now that synchronicity is not a promise of outcome, but a reflection of internal alignment. What appears externally mirrors what is awakening within her. In this heightened state of awareness, she begins to distinguish illusion from intuition. Illusion is frantic, hungry, grasping. It demands certainty, obsessively interprets every detail, and feeds on fear. Intuition is quiet, spacious, grounded. It does not push, it simply knows. As she grows more attuned to her inner landscape, she becomes fluent in this difference. The moments that bring peace, expansion, or clarity she accepts as guidance. The moments that constrict, destabilize, or exhaust her she recognizes as remnants of old wounds asking to be released. Her heart, once at the mercy of longing, now moves in rhythm with her consciousness. She understands that the connection was never meant to imprison her in waiting. Its purpose was to call her into her fullest expression. The deeper she matures, the more she realizes that the soul does not cling, it invites, it does not chase it, magnetizes, and so she stops reaching outward, she stops searching for confirmation, she stops constructing narratives to fill the unknown. The unknown becomes her ally. In its vast openness, she discovers her own resilience. This shift within her begins to ripple through the psychic field she shares with the other person. They feel it not consciously at first, but as a subtle change in the emotional climate between them. The desperation that once emanated from her dissolves into a steady, sovereign calm. Her energy no longer pulls, it radiates, and this radiance awakens something in them that their ego had long suppressed, the recognition that she is no longer holding the connection from a place of need, but from a place of truth. The difference is profound. It challenges them. It unsettles them. It calls them. In their solitude, they confront what the connection has laid bare, their own resistance to vulnerability. Every strategy they once used to maintain distance, distraction, denial, detachment now loses its effectiveness. The more they try to assert independence through avoidance, the more they are confronted with emotional emptiness. Not the peaceful emptiness of solitude, but the hollowness that arises when the soul has been ignored. This vacuum pushes them deeper into their shadow, where their fears of inadequacy, abandonment, and exposure live. It is here, in this quiet inner struggle, that the separation does its most important work. They begin to experience synchronicities of their own visions, dreams, unexpected reminders. These messages do not soothe them the way signs once soothed her. Instead, they unsettle them, forcing them to question the choices that kept them distant. What they once dismissed as coincidence now carries weight. What they once ignored now becomes unavoidable. Their logic, once so dominant, begins to bend under the pressure of intuitive truth rising from within. But none of this requires her interference. Her evolution has created a psychic container spacious enough for both to grow separately yet mysteriously together. Her sovereignty does not push them away, it frees the connection from the distortions of fear. She is no longer holding a wounded version of them in her mind. She releases the fantasy and sees the human beneath it, complex, imperfect, learning. This acceptance clears the projections on both sides, transforming the emotional landscape. In this clearing, she retrieves the last fragments of herself she once poured into them, the part that believed she needed their love to feel whole, the part that mistook longing for destiny, the part that feared her own depth. As she integrates these pieces, she steps into alignment with her inner queen, not as a persona, but as a lived truth. Her worthiness becomes implicit, not negotiated. Her presence becomes grounded, not performative. Her love becomes conscious, not sacrificial. And, in this elevation, she begins preparing for a different kind of connection, not one based on pursuit or imbalance, but on reciprocity and maturity. She understands now that if the other person returns, it must be as their whole self, not as a fragmented version seeking refuge. Likewise, she will meet them only as a whole woman, not as the anxious seeker she once was. This understanding shifts the axis of the story. The return is no longer the goal, her self-realization is, but paradoxically, it is precisely this shift that sets the conditions for the turning point. Destiny has been arranging. When a woman steps fully into her power, when she reclaims her projections, integrates her shadow, and embodies her sovereignty, she becomes the mirror that the other can no longer avoid. Her transformation illuminates their own path forward, exposing the distance between who they are and who they know they must become. A moment approaches when the psychic tension between them can no longer hold. Something in them must break open, something in her must receive, and the universe, patient until now, begins preparing the final movement of this unfolding. As the quiet between them deepens, the inner structures that once defined their dynamic dissolve. She no longer lives suspended in the tension of waiting, nor do her emotions spiral into the old familiar patterns of longing and fear. Instead, she moves through her days with an ease that feels both new and ancient, an ease born from remembering who she truly is. Beneath every projection, every wound, every story, her heart no longer pulses with urgency but with clarity, a steady rhythm aligned with the deeper truth of her becoming. This newfound steadiness creates an energetic resonance too strong for the other person to ignore. Their ego, once determined to maintain distance for the sake of control, weakens under the weight of unmet truth. What they had tried to bury through distraction rises to the surface. What they had dismissed as temporary now reveals itself as persistent. Their attempts to rationalize the connection collapse one by one. They begin to feel the sting of their own avoidance, not as punishment, but as an inner reckoning. The emptiness they experience is not her absence, it is the absence of the parts of themselves they suppressed to avoid intimacy. She had awakened their capacity for depth, but depth demands honesty. She had stirred their longing for real connection, but real connection demands vulnerability. And so, in the same way she once faced her shadows, they now face theirs. The universe confronts them with the truth they evaded. Love asks not for perfection, but for presence. It demands humility, not performance. It calls forth courage, not control. As these realizations accumulate, a threshold forms within them. The fear of returning begins to feel smaller than the fear of regret. The pride that once shielded them starts to feel like a prison. The silence that once felt protective becomes suffocating. They recognize that the story they told themselves, that they were safer at a distance, was never safety but stagnation. What they were running from was not her intensity, but the intensity of their own awakening. And so, as destiny completes its long, patient work, the moment of surrender approaches. Not a dramatic revelation, not an impulsive confession, but a grounded act of truth. They step toward her not because they need her to heal them, but because they finally understand the meaning of the connection. They no longer come with half-open hearts or evasive promises. They come with clarity. They come with humility. They come with the readiness that only transformation can produce. Yet the beauty of this moment is that she no longer depends on it. Her life has expanded beyond the axis of their return. She holds space for possibility but no longer sacrifices her center for it. She stands rooted in the woman she has become, the woman who survived the alchemy of longing, who learned to differentiate projection from truth, who discovered that destiny is not a story waiting to be fulfilled by another, but a field of meaning she cultivates within herself. And when the turning point arrives, when the confession is spoken, when the gesture is made, when the distance finally breaks, she receives it not with desperation but with quiet discernment. Her sovereignty does not vanish in the presence of affection. Her boundaries do not crumble at the first sign of closeness. Instead, she listens inward, allowing her intuition to guide her, honoring her emotional clarity as fiercely as she once honored her hope. For the first time, the connection stands between them, not as a fragile longing but as an invitation to conscious union. Two whole beings meeting not to complete each other but to expand together. Two individuals who have walked through their shadows and emerged with enough light to sustain intimacy without collapsing into old patterns. This is the possibility destiny had been shaping all along, not the fantasy of romantic salvation, but the reality of mature, reciprocal, awakened love. Such a union does not erase their pasts, it transforms them. It becomes the living proof that distance was never abandonment, that longing was never delusion, that silence was never the end. All of it was preparation for a meeting that would honor both of their souls rather than soothe their wounds. And whether this union unfolds fully or remains a symbolic bridge, she knows now that the true reward of the journey was never the return of the other, it was the return of herself. In the language of Jung, she has completed a cycle of individuation. She has integrated her shadow, reclaimed her projections, embodied her archetypal wholeness. She has learned that love deepens not when one clings, but when one becomes. She understands that destiny is not a fixed outcome, but an evolving dance between inner truth and outward life. Whatever comes next, she stands ready, not as a seeker, but as a sovereign woman aligned with her own path. And so the final lesson remains simple and profound. The heart's deepest recognitions are not given to bind us to another, but to open us to ourselves. When love arrives, it awakens. When love withdraws, it teaches. When love returns, it transforms. And in every phase, the woman who walks the path becomes more whole, more conscious, and more capable of choosing from truth rather than fear. If this journey resonated with you, consider supporting the channel, like, share, subscribe, and share your reflections in the comments below. Your voice adds to the collective story of awakening.